This is a sneak peek into the new seller payment to buyer's broker form, which is going to be revised in this June. This is a draft. The final is slated to come out in June. Also, the cooperating broker compensation agreement form. Both of these forms have been revised considerably. I know the text that's red shows the revision. However, this was actually revised even more than you see because there were whole sections taken out. And you can see there's a lot that's changed here. Now, this specifically is very important because this has to do with the post-NAR settlement era and how agents are getting paid in the future. Now, I will put a link in the description to download both of these forms in PDF format if you want to download one just for your own reference or to follow along. So I'll draw your attention over here to the new RPA. Now, the new RPA hasn't changed that much, but on page 2 of it, you'll see that this section, which I think will be used much more commonly in the future, seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement, and then they reference the SPBB form, which is this that we're going through. And this will be checked more often because every buyer is going to have to sign this new buyer representation agreement. And this form has had a total overhaul, and I have a different video on it I just did. But you can see here that this is what the buyer is going to pay their agent. And then when agents write an offer, they're going to check this box and include this form asking the seller to pay the buyer's obligation on the buyer representation agreement. And then we'll jump right down to the changes here and the most important part. All the other stuff, you can skim through, and when the final version comes out, I'll do a tutorial on that. But for now, we'll just focus in on the most important elements. All right, so right here, we put the percentage, the amount, okay? And now here's what's interesting. It says maximum seller payment obligation. Seller shall only be obligated to pay buyer's broker the lesser of the amount here or the amount on the buyer representation agreement. That's it. So whatever you put here is the max. Whatever you put on the buyer representation agreement is the max that you can get paid from anyone on the transaction. That's why buyer's agents do not want to put a small number here, because that will limit how much they can get paid on a transaction. Let's jump back to this form. And that's what's saying here. It's also saying if there's no buyer representation agreement, the seller has no obligation to pay a buyer's broker. Then they go on to say that this is an acknowledgement that a buyer representation does indeed exist, and that right here in delivery, that the buyer's broker or agent will furnish the seller or the seller's broker a copy of the buyer representation agreement. So I've mentioned on other videos for this buyer representation agreement that don't put a super low number. Don't try to beat out other buyer's agents by offering a low number here, because you're just setting a limit as to how much you can make. Because on this form, even if you ask the seller to pay 5% to you, the buyer's agent, the seller is still limited by whatever's on this form. So that's where this limitation comes into place. It's reinforced here. Okay, this form's pretty straightforward. After that, you're just going to sign. It's a one-page form. You can skim it very, very quickly. And then over here, now this is a little different because in this form that we just looked at, we're asking the seller to pay the buyer's obligation, because whatever the seller pays or whatever the listing broker pays is deducted from what the buyer has to pay on their buyer representation agreement. Now, the CBC form, which has been around forever, but now this has been revised, because the old CBC form, it had, if you want to modify how much is in the MLS, or if it's not in the MLS, it had all these references to modifying or eliminating commission and the MLS. But now the MLS is not part of the whole commission conversation. So if an agent wants to be paid by a listing broker, here's a scenario. Maybe the buyer's agent calls up the listing agent and says, I'm sending an offer, and asks about commission. Well, the listing agent may have said, well, I'm charging 5% and I'm paying 2.5% to the buyer's agent. Okay, if that's the case, if the listing broker is offering a cooperating broker compensation, just how things have been up until this point, you would just send this form, the CBC form. And then you could put right here, seller's broker agrees to pay buyer's broker. And then you put in whatever the cooperating broker compensation is. It's really that simple. That's what this form boils down to, asking the listing broker to pay. And that's still going to offset the buyer's obligation, because it doesn't matter where the money comes from. If you're getting paid as a buyer's agent, that's deducted from what the buyer owes you. And we jump back here. Now, this form, the CBC form, cooperating broker, this form isn't built into the RPA like the seller payment of buyer's broker. So what I'd recommend, if you're having your commission come from the listing broker, I recommend scrolling down to here, and you could just check this box, other, and write in the CBC form. Or you could go to other terms and write in cooperating broker compensation agreement. This form right here is hereby incorporated into this agreement, something like that. But I would make a mention of the CBC on the purchase agreement. So that's it. The CBC is collecting your commission from the listing broker, and the SPBB is collecting your commission directly from the seller. And this will likely be used when there's a seller concession offered to the buyer. And you'll see that on the MLS. The MLS has indicated they will have a optional seller concession box, and that seller concession amount can be used for whatever the buyer wants. But most buyers, since they're all going to sign a buyer representation agreement, are going to want to have that seller concession, which is a seller credit, another way of saying seller credit, go toward their obligation in the buyer representation agreement. Anyway, once the final version comes out, I will do a full tutorial. You can download these forms. If you look in the description, I will have the links. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.